That night, just hours after the vaccination, baby Truc Lam suddenly couldn't sleep. Her tiny body kept jerking, and her soft cries echoed through the quiet house, growing more restless with each passing moment. Trieu Duong quickly realized something wasn't right. His daughter wasn't just tired, she was uncomfortable, maybe even scared. Without hesitation, he picked her up and began searching for a way to soothe her, adjusting her sleeping space and staying by her side, determined to help her feel safe again. But would his quiet efforts be enough to calm her through the night? Or was this only the beginning of a long, sleepless struggle? If you enjoy gentle, heartwarming stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments, have you ever stayed up all night just to comfort someone you love? That night, after coming home from the vaccination, the little house felt quieter than usual. The air was still, the kind of stillness that usually made it easier for a baby to sleep. But for Trieu Duong, it quickly became clear that tonight would be different. Baby Truc Lam could not settle down. At first, it was only a small sound, a soft whimper, then another. Then her tiny body suddenly jerked in her sleep, and a fragile cry slipped out into the darkness. It was not the loud kind of crying. It was weaker than that, more tired, more uncomfortable. The kind of cry that made a father's heart tighten right away. Trieu Duong had already been lying nearby, resting lightly, never fully asleep. The moment he heard her, he opened his eyes and turned toward her. In the dim light, he could see her little hands moving uneasily, her face tense, her body unable to relax. He knew immediately that something was not right. Maybe her body still felt sore after the shot. Maybe she was frightened without knowing why. Maybe the discomfort was small, but for a baby that small, even a little uneasiness could feel overwhelming. Whatever the reason, he did not hesitate for a second. He sat up at once and reached for her carefully. The moment he lifted Truc Lam into his arms, he held her close against his chest, one hand supporting her tiny back, the other gently cradling her head. He did not rush. He did not panic. He just stood there quietly for a moment, letting her feel his warmth, letting her know she was not alone. Then he began to walk. Step by step, slowly, patiently, he moved around the room with his daughter in his arms. His body was tired from the long day, but he kept going. He patted her lightly, swayed gently, and lowered his head from time to time, as if trying to tell her without words that everything would be all right. Her crying softened a little, but the moment he tried to place her back down, she startled again. Her eyes squeezed shut, her mouth trembled, and another wave of crying came. Not angry crying, not demanding crying, just the helpless, restless crying of a baby who wanted to sleep but could not find comfort. So Trieu Duong picked her up again immediately. There was no frustration on his face, only concern. He walked again, more slowly this time, holding her even closer. He could feel how small she was in his arms, so fragile, so dependent on him. And in moments like this, the whole world seemed to narrow into one simple responsibility: help his daughter feel safe. Outside, the night stretched on. There was no noise, no distraction, nothing to pull him away from that moment. Just a tired father, a sleepless baby, and the quiet rhythm of love that kept moving even when the body wanted to stop. After a long while, Truc Lam's crying faded again. Her breathing seemed calmer. Her little body loosened just slightly, as if sleep might finally return. Carefully, very carefully, he tried once more to lay her down. But again, almost as soon as her body touched the bed, she stirred in discomfort, and started crying all over. This time, Trieu Duong did not try to rush her back to sleep. He understood now that she did not just need rest. She needed reassurance. She needed to feel protected enough to let go. So instead of forcing the moment, he sat beside her and watched quietly. One hand rested near her, ready the second she needed him. His eyes stayed on her face, studying every small reaction, every tiny movement, searching for some way to make things easier for her. Then he looked at her sleeping area more carefully. It was enough for an ordinary night. But tonight was not an ordinary night. Tonight, after the injection, her body seemed extra sensitive. Maybe the place where she was lying did not feel soft enough. Maybe the surface felt too flat, too firm, too unfamiliar for a baby who was already uneasy. That thought stayed with him. Without making any sudden noise, Trieu Duong began adjusting her little sleeping space, using what he already had nearby. He worked quietly in the middle of the night, not because anyone was watching, not because it was something grand, but because love often shows itself most clearly in small, unnoticed things. He checked the fabric beneath her. He straightened it. He added a softer layer. He smoothed every wrinkle with his hands so nothing would bother her delicate skin. He adjusted her blanket so it would feel gentle and comforting without being too heavy. Everything he did was slow and careful, as if even the smallest touch carried meaning. From time to time, Truc Lam whimpered again, and each time he stopped immediately to comfort her. He picked her up before the crying could build too much. He held her against his shoulder and gently rocked from side to side. He whispered softly near her ear, not saying anything complicated, only the kind of quiet, soothing sounds a father makes when words do not matter as much as presence. His voice was low and warm. His arms never left her for long. Once her breathing eased, he lowered her again, testing whether the small changes had helped. He stayed right there, one hand resting lightly beside her, the other gently patting her stomach in a slow, calming rhythm. For a moment, she stayed still. He did not move. He barely even breathed. Then she stirred again, but this time the cry was smaller, weaker, not as panicked as before. Trieu Duong leaned in immediately and placed a comforting hand on her. He rubbed her gently, then lifted her just enough to settle her again. He stayed close enough for her to feel him, close enough so that if she opened her eyes or startled awake, the first thing she would sense was her father beside her. The hours moved slowly like that. Pick her up, walk, hold her close, put her down, comfort her again, adjust the blanket, smooth the bed, stay beside her, watch, listen, wait. It was exhausting work, but he never treated it like a burden. Because when your baby is hurting, even a little, rest stops mattering. Sleep stops mattering. What matters is that the child in your arms feels protected. What matters is that they know someone is there through every uncomfortable moment, every cry, every restless breath. That was what Trieu Duong gave his daughter that night. Not a big solution, not anything expensive or perfect, just himself, his patience, his warmth, his steady presence in the darkness. Little by little, Truc Lam began to respond. Her cries no longer came in sharp bursts. The tension in her tiny face started to soften. Her breathing, which had been uneven and shaky, slowly became deeper and more regular. Every now and then, she still gave a faint sound, but it was no longer the cry of a baby fighting discomfort alone. It was the fading restlessness of a child being carried gently back toward peace. Trieu Duong noticed every small improvement. He did not celebrate too early. He did not step away. He stayed exactly where he was, seated close beside her, one hand still near her little body, ready at any second. The room felt different now, still quiet, but softer somehow. The kind of quiet that comes after love has done its work. And in that calm, with the long night still wrapped around them, Trieu Duong looked at his daughter and understood something deeply simple. Sometimes caring for a child is not about fixing everything at once. Sometimes it is just about staying through the tears, through the sleeplessness, through the helpless little cries, until the baby in your care finally feels safe enough to rest. So he remained there beside Truc Lam, protecting her sleep the way he had protected her through the whole night, with nothing but gentle hands, a watchful heart, and the quiet strength of a father who could not bear to leave his child alone in discomfort. Even after Truc Lam had calmed down a little, Trieu Duong still did not allow himself to relax. He had seen enough to know that nights like this could change again in just a few minutes. A baby might seem peaceful one moment, then suddenly startle awake and cry all over again. So instead of lying down to rest, he stayed seated right beside her, quietly watching in the soft darkness. The house was silent except for the faint sound of her breathing. Every few seconds, his eyes returned to her face. Was she still tense? Was her body relaxed? Would she wake again? These were the only things on his mind now. Trieu Duong leaned forward and gently touched the blanket once more, making sure it sat comfortably around her. He adjusted the edge near her little shoulder so it would not bunch up. He checked the softness beneath her one more time, pressing lightly with his hand, making sure the place where she lay felt more secure, more comforting, more suitable for a baby who had already gone through too much discomfort for one day. He knew he could not take away the soreness from the injection. He could not explain to her why. She felt uneasy. He could not ask her what hurt or exactly what she needed. But as her father, he could still do something meaningful. He could stay. He could pay attention. He could keep trying until her small body finally found peace. That was enough to keep him awake. For a while, Truc Lam seemed to drift deeper into sleep. Her tiny chest rose and fell in a steadier rhythm now. Her hands, which had been curling and twitching before, were beginning to rest more naturally. Her face looked softer too, no longer strained by that same restless discomfort from earlier. Trieu Duong sat there, watching her with the kind of care only a parent understands. It was not dramatic. There were no big words. No one else was around to notice what he was doing. But this was the truest kind of devotion, the kind that happens quietly when the whole world is asleep, and only one person chooses to keep fighting tiredness because someone smaller needs them. He rested his arm near her so that she would still sense his presence. Every now and then, he gave the gentlest little pat, just enough to reassure her without waking her. It was almost instinct now, the movement of a father whose whole attention had narrowed to the fragile comfort of his child. Then after some time, Truc Lam stirred again. It was only a small movement at first, a slight twitch, a little frown. Then her lips trembled and a weak cry rose again into the still night. Without waiting even a second, Trieu Duong reached for her. He lifted her carefully back into his arms, cradling her close against his chest, as if he had been expecting this all along. His body was heavier now with fatigue, his shoulders tired, his eyes burning from staying awake so long. But none of that changed the softness of the way he held her. He stood again and resumed the slow walk he had been doing all night. Back and forth, one step, then another. Gentle, steady, patient. His daughter rested against him, still unsettled, still too fragile to be left alone with her discomfort. So he gave her what she needed most: warmth, closeness, and the unshaken rhythm of a father who refused to let her feel unsafe. He lightly rubbed her back. He rocked her near his shoulder. He lowered his face beside hers and whispered softly again, not with urgent energy, but with calm. It was the kind of calm that tells a baby everything she cannot yet understand with words. I'm here. You're safe. You don't have to go through this alone. That gentle pacing continued for what felt like forever. The night had become long and heavy, but Trieu Duong did not count the hours. He did not think about how tired he would feel tomorrow. He did not complain, even in silence. In his mind, there was only one thing that mattered: helping Truc Lam get through this difficult night. After another stretch of patient rocking, her cries weakened again. Her head settled more heavily against him. Her breathing slowed. This time, before laying her down, he paused. He looked at the little sleeping place he had adjusted earlier. He checked it all over once more, making tiny improvements where he could. He made the surface smoother. He made sure the blanket would rest gently around her. He created the softest, safest space he could with the simple things he had on hand. Then he lowered her carefully, very slowly, as though even the air itself should not disturb her. He kept one hand beneath her just a little longer after she was down, letting her transition from his arms without losing that feeling of security too quickly. Only when he felt her body remain calm did he gradually pull his hand away. Still, he stayed close. He did not return to his own place. He sat right there beside her, his body angled toward her, one hand resting near enough to comfort her at any moment. He watched her face. He listened to every breath. He measured every tiny movement with quiet concern. And this time, something changed. The tension did not return. The crying did not rise again. Instead, Truc Lam gave one small sigh, then settled more fully into sleep. Her little face softened completely now. Her body no longer jerked in discomfort. The fragile unrest that had followed her home after the vaccination finally seemed to be loosening its grip. The baby who had cried in waves, startled awake again and again, was at last beginning to rest. Trieu Duong remained still, almost afraid to break the moment. He looked at her for a long time. The room, once filled with restless sounds, now held only calm. And in that calm, his own tiredness began to wash over him. But even then, he did not hurry to sleep. He stayed beside her a little longer, just to be sure, just to protect this hard-won peace. There was love in every small thing he had done that night. In the way he got up the moment she cried, in the way he held her without impatience, in the way he adjusted it. Her sleeping space in the middle of the night, trying to make it softer, gentler, more comforting. In the way he kept choosing her comfort over his own rest, again and again, without hesitation. None of it was loud. None of it was meant to impress anyone. But this is what fatherly love often looks like in real life. Not speeches, not grand gestures, just quiet sacrifice, just tired arms that keep holding, just footsteps in the dark, just a father who stays until his child finally feels safe. As Trieu Duong watched Truc Lam sleeping peacefully at last, he seemed to understand something even more deeply than before. Babies do not remember every detail of a difficult night. They do not remember every cry, every moment of discomfort, every time they woke and could not settle. But they do feel something lasting in those moments. They feel whether someone is there, They feel whether they are protected. They feel whether love remains close when they are at their most vulnerable. And tonight, Truc Lam had felt exactly that. She had felt her father's arms. She had felt his patience. She had felt his presence beside her through every restless moment. That was what carried her through the night. Eventually, the silence around them became peaceful instead of tense. The kind of silence that comes only after struggle has finally given way to rest. Trieu Duong lowered his eyes for a moment, still seated beside his daughter, still guarding her sleep even now. He was exhausted, but his heart was calm, because the baby who could not sleep, who cried and startled and searched helplessly for comfort, was finally resting. And in that quiet moment, one truth stood out more clearly than anything else. Sometimes love does not need big words or perfect solutions. Sometimes love is simply a father staying close through the longest night, holding on until his child feels safe enough to let go. That was all Trieu Duong wanted for Truc Lam. Not anything complicated, just comfort, just safety, just the warmth of knowing that no matter how hard the night felt, her father would always be there beside her. And with that steady protection surrounding her, baby Truc Lam finally slept in peace. After returning home from vaccination, baby Truc Lam becomes restless and unable to sleep. She startles repeatedly and cries softly through the night, making Trieu Duong realize something is wrong. Knowing she feels uncomfortable and insecure, he gently carries her in his arms, walking slowly and soothing her with warmth and patience. Each time he tries to lay her down, she wakes again, so he stays close and carefully adjusts her sleeping space to make it softer and more comforting. Throughout the long night, he never leaves her side, choosing to comfort her again and again instead of resting. Little by little, her breathing calms and her body relaxes. In that quiet moment, Trieu Duong understands that sometimes love is simply staying beside your child until they finally feel safe enough to sleep.